Mic check. Are we good? I can stop now? Okay. We're good? Okay. All right. So, Pre-Calculus Podcast. Episode 4, Nonlinear System of Equations and Inequalities. I am your host. And let's begin. Today we are in widescreen. Okay, so nonlinear systems of equations, which is basically meaning that we are taking, we are trying to find the intersect of two things that aren't linear. Okay, so you don't have a line, you don't have two lines crossing like what we've always done before, where we've had two lines intersect where they cross. Now we're going to be looking at what if we have a line and something else, or a conic section. So in this case, we have our circle and a line cutting through the circle, and we want to know where does it intersect. Okay, so we want to know where does it cross, where do they cross, and everything. One way of doing it is using a calculator. So if you're able to set up your calculator and graph both functions, that's one way you can do it perfectly acceptable. The problem with that is that sometimes it's very hard to try to plug in a formula or an equation into your calculator if your calculator isn't set up to do conic sections. Okay, so what we're going to do here is that we're going to take our two equations that we have, and we're going to solve one of the equations for x or y. So you don't have to do it for both, you just need it for one. So I'm going to solve the bottom one for y. So I get y equals 3x over 4, which would be the linear function if we want to graph it. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this and I'm going to plug it into that y. And when I plug it into the y of the other equation, I have it set up and I can try to find what my x values are. Okay. So I've plugged it in, that squared, yada, 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 gets me 9x squared over 16. I'm going to add x squared plus 9x squared over 16 because they are the same variable. Gets me 25x squared over 16. And now I go through and I solve. I end up with x squared equals 16, which means that my x values must be plus or minus 4. Okay, so this is just solve one of the variables for x or y, plug it into the other function, and then go through and solve. You could have done the same thing if you solved for y. You would have gotten the same basic answer. You would have just found the y first. So now I have this plus or minus 1 or plus or minus 4, and now I'm going to take this and I need to find the y. So I'm going to take these plus or minus 4s and I'm going to plug them into either equations. Okay, either equations for the x, because we're looking for where they intersect, so they should both have the same y value when I plug them in. Okay, so plus or minus 4 in this case, and positive 4 and negative 4 because there's 2. I plug it into the right equation because it's the easier one to deal with, and I end up getting my answer of 3 and negative 3. So that means my point would be 4, 3, and negative 4, negative 3, which would be my point of intersect. Which, if we go all the way back to the original graph we have, you could visually see that we had one point in the first quadrant and one point in the third quadrant, which would have been both negative or one positive. Okay, so that's how you're going to do this, is that you would end up solving the one of the variables, plugging it in to find the other one. Now, it's just like linear system of equations, but it's just more complicated because there's more complicated functions, but the process is still the same. Okay, so what if they don't cross? So let's say we have these two. We have a parabola and we have a line, and you can see from this graph that they do not cross. So what if they don't cross? Are we still going to get an answer? And the answer to that is yes. You can always get an answer in mathematics. So let's say we have these two functions, and what you want to do is you want to solve for one of them for one of the variables. It doesn't matter which one. This one actually has it already set up where you can solve for the y. And so what's going to happen here is that I'm going to take this and I'm going to substitute it into this y. So when I substitute it into that y, I end up with my function of x plus 3 minus x squared equals 5. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to move everything to the left-hand side so that I have my function. Set up as negative x squared plus x minus 2 equals 0. So now I have my quadratic function. And now that I have my quadratic function, I can try to factor it if you can. In this case, you can't factor it. Two numbers multiplied together get you a Positive 2 added together gets you a positive 1. Doesn't work. So that means we have to use our quadratic formula, okay, or quadratic equation. So negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a is something that you're going to have to do. So plugging it all in, solving it all the way through, you see I end up getting a square root of a negative 7. And since it's the square root of negative 7, I have to use my imagination and use an I, or use an imaginary number. So just because they don't cross doesn't mean you won't get an answer, you just get an imaginary answer. So you just have an imaginary number that you have to deal with in these. So these shouldn't be any, no solution. No, you're going to have solutions. You're going to need to make sure that they are real or imaginary, depending on the situation. Okay, so if they don't cross, you're going to end up with some imaginary numbers. Okay, system of linear or nonlinear system of inequalities is just like when we had other inequalities, we would have our dotted or solid lines and we would be graphing them. So the first one is, if you remember from conic sections, like a few slides, tap, go, that would be a circle. Okay, so we end up with a circle with a radius of 5, and then we have a line cutting through it. And the things still apply with the dotted and solid. The first one's a solid line because it's equal to, so it's less than or equal to. Well, the second one is dotted because it's just greater than, it's not equal to. Okay, so that's why the line is a dotted line while the circle is a solid line. Now, as you see with the intersect, if we were to solve this bottom one, we end up with our y is less than positive 3x over 4. So that's how we get that one, which again shouldn't be anything new, should be fairly simple. For graphing, that's why we shade below. Now with the circle, okay, one way to do it is just to check a point. Plug in a point and see if it works or not. 0, 0 is a perfect one. So if I plug 0, 0 into that circle equation, does it end up being a true statement? 0 squared plus 0 squared is, it's not that big of a secret, it's 0. 0 is 0 less than or equal to 25. The answer is yes. So that means we would shade where 0, 0 is. In this case, inside the circle. So since we shaded inside the circle and we're shading this half, that means that that segment where we have our double shaded ends up being our answer. Okay. So when you have your system of inequalities, you just graph both functions and then shade them. Okay. Look at that. We're already done. This has been a super quick one. So this is the end of this episode. Here's your homework. Make sure you work on it. And yeah, that's it.